Hi, my name is Michael Dash, and I'd like to welcome you to our new series called Fate From Addict to Entrepreneur. That's right, I used to be an addict. I had a gambling addiction for over 20 years that I have been able to overcome and transition into entrepreneurship, where I've run a company for the past 10 years. Through this series of interviews that we've conducted with some of the most successful former addicts who've gone on to build amazing companies, you will get a glimpse into the roads traveled, the depths of darkness, but also the mountaintop of success. We really want to bring this conversation to light in society. Addicts are usually shunned, but addicts have some of the best minds in the world. And given the right support, they can rise from the ashes and create great companies that are giving back to society and employing hundreds of thousands of people. So I hope you enjoy the series. Look forward to your feedback and look forward to bringing this conversation to the mainstream and supporting anybody in addiction, because it could be somebody in your family, it could be somebody in your office, it could be one of your friends. Thank you and enjoy. All right. I wanted to welcome everybody to our series on founders and addiction. I am extremely humbled to have Joe Polish on with us today from the Genius Network. Joe is not only a recovering addict himself, but he is the founder of Genius Network, which is the highest level network in the world for successful entrepreneurs. We'll let Joe tell you a little bit more about that as we get into the conversation. But I think a great way to start, Joe, would kind of be talking about your addiction. You know, your path through whatever it is that you were addicted to, because we're talking to gambling addicts, alcoholic addicts, drug addicts, but recovering addicts, current addicts, as well as the non-traditional forms of addiction. So why don't we open up with your story and take the conversation from there?
Yeah, sounds good. And I'll try to do the short version of this, which this whole story could take 3 hours if I had to. So in a nutshell, I believe that addiction is a response to trauma. And so I have to look at what happened early on in my childhood, which ended up later in life becoming manifested as what we call addiction. And so my mother was a former nun, and she left the convent because she had gotten ill. She met my father in church. They ended up getting married. She ended up having 2 children. I have an older brother, 4.5 years older than me, and myself. And so when she was, in her late 30s, she was ill, and she died when I was 4 years old. She was 42 years old when she died, and she died of some type of stomach cancer. And so when I lost my mother, my father lost the love of his life. He was tormented. He was broken. He never recovered from it. He never remarried. And he was a locksmith, so we never made a lot of money. We weren't dirt poor, but we lived in trailers about half of my childhood. And every 2 years, we would move to a different town, because as soon as my father started getting established in his business, he had this weird form of self-sabotage where he would uproot and we would move to another place because he just never could settle down anywhere. And when I was between the ages of 8 to 10 years old, I started getting molested as a kid. And I was a shy, introverted, scared, skinny kid. People used to pick on me. And when I was getting molested, I was paid to not say anything about it. And that left me with a tremendous amount of shame and confusion and feeling like a worthless piece of shit, basically. And also during that time, I was trying to play sports. I was in the Little League baseball team, and I had a sadistic baseball coach that would force me to hold the baseball bat straight up in a certain way where I couldn't lean it back. If I leaned the baseball bat back, I could hit the ball okay, but he would force me to hold it straight up because he would say it was better form. and I was, not yet a pain in the ass teenager. I was this little kid trying to play sports, and it literally ruined my liking of sports. I hated it, and so because I couldn't play the game, and so I quit the team, and then all the other, not all of them, but some of the kids on the team started picking on me and bullying me and beating me up and stuff, and that was very painful. I also came home one day, and this was in a small town called Alpine, Texas. And my only dog that I ever had was a black Labrador retriever named Panther. And I love that dog. It's one of the only things in my life that seemed to be, some semblance of being healthy. And I came home one day and my father had given my dog away. And that was, just a terrible experience for me. So all during, I'm getting molested. My dad gives my dog away. I'm getting, going through the sports. It was a shitty time in my childhood. And so, I didn't know how to cope with it other than just feeling terrible. I didn't know what to do. And so we ended up moving. Again, I ended up in Arizona. And, well, actually, I shouldn't say directly. We then went to a different town in New Mexico. Then we ended up in Arizona. And I'm giving you the short version of what could be a very long story. And
sure.
Between the ages of 16 to 18 years old, I started doing a lot of drugs. It started with marijuana, and I started, getting high. And I went from being the shy, scared, introverted kid to becoming one of the most popular people in my high school, not because of sports, not because of any academic abilities, just simply because I was a partier. And the drugs opened up my ability to be social and to interact, and this fear that I had opened up into this, kind of a joy and a pleasure and an engagement with life, because of course it was affecting the biochemistry of my brain.
Sure.
Part of addiction is it's biochemical. It's serotonin, it's dopamine. And so the problem was...
Just a quick question there. So when you were, participating in these drugs and becoming more popular and everything, were you actually dealing these drugs as well?
Oh, absolutely. Because the only way to pay for the drugs was to deal drugs. And so, and any addict knows, like, your lifestyle and your friends and all of your circle of relationships center around the way that you're living. Yes. Chris Rock has this interesting skit he heard of years ago. He's like, if you're a crackhead, you don't, you're married to another crack. You're not married. You're going to be married to another crackhead. You're not like waking up at 5 a.m, putting on a 3-piece suit, and you're married to a crackhead. I mean, you kind of hang out with the same sort of people. So yeah, I was certainly dealing drugs, doing drugs, and it started with pot. And like the line with cocaine, where if you're a cocaine addict, there's the shortest line is too much, and the longest line is never enough. The problem with drugs is that there was no limit. I mean, I just couldn't get enough. So it started with pot. Then I started taking pills, speed, some types of amphetamines, smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol, then taking acid, mushrooms, snorting cocaine, snorting crystal meth. And then in my worst state, when I was 18 years old, I started freebasing.
Through my addiction, which we all have cross addictions, one breeds into the other. As I hear you speaking, one drug for me wasn't enough. I needed another high. I needed to feel higher than the high I had established with that one drug. So it would just be one on top of the other, on top of the other. Well, what does this do? What does this do? What does this do? Sounds like a similar road that you travel.
I don't think there's any such thing as a pure alcoholic. I mean, almost everyone has multiple addictions. And because, again, I believe addiction is a solution. It sounds weird to some people. My goal, because having built what I do for a living with Genius Network and all of the stuff that I do, I'm just using my marketing skills to change the global conversation about how people view and treat addicts with compassion instead of judgment, and finding the best forms of treatment that have efficacy, and then sharing those with the world. So it's rare that you're going to find just an alcoholic or a drug addict or a sex addict or a gambling addict or a food addict or an internet addict or a workaholic. Workaholism is a respectable addiction, but all addictions involve binging and purging, obsessiveness, deprivation. I mean, there's no middle ground. Moderation doesn't make any sense to the addict brain, to the addict body, to the pain body that is the addiction, because it just wants more. The opposite of addiction is connection, and you're just trying to connect with something. You know, Bill W. and Dr. Bob, the founders of AA, you know, one of my favorite lines from them is, as alcoholics, we're trying to drink God out of a bottle. So if you're an alcoholic, you're trying to drink your way to that God, to that sort. Even if you're an atheist, that line has always made sense. If you're a gambling addict, you know, as you've discussed, you know, you're trying to gamble your way to that rush, that chase, that high.
Yep.
For gambling. If you're a sex addict, you're trying to masturbate your way to that, you know, to that source, to that feeling, to that connection. With everything, it's all trying to find it. Addiction is looking for love in all the wrong places, and you know, we want it, we desire it, we crave it, and it's a solution. If you're in a halt state, you know, hungry, angry, lonely, tired, if you're in pain, if you're depressed, if you're in anxiety, there's nothing wrong with wanting that pain to go away. It's just the mechanism that you use to scratch the itch. And when you use something to scratch the itch that's like scratching with razor blades, you just kind of fuck yourself up quite a bit. And so mine was drugs initially early on. And in my worst state, I weighed 105 pounds from freebasing cocaine, because one of my worst states was I had gone 3.5 months straight smoking coke every single day. You know, I was blowing my nose and blood was coming out every day. I was barely eating. You know, on average, I weighed about 120 pounds, but there was 1 week where I just had not eaten at all, and I'd gotten so skinny. And when you're, you know, 5'10", male, 18 years old, 105 pounds is pretty skinny. 120 pounds is still a rail.
Wow.
That was.
And were you able to, were you going to school? Were you able to function, or were you just not even showing up there? And you know, this is a day, every day it was about finding the drug to, you know, tell me if I'm wrong, but to either get high or get normal, because at that point, high is normal. And if you don't feed that, then you have some massive, you know, probably physical reactions.
Yeah, I mean, you know, my life consisted of waking up to get high and getting high to go to bed. I mean, so a lot of it was, you know, centered around, you know, the doing of drugs. You know, I mean, Pat Carnes, who's, you know, a friend of mine and you know, considered the top doctor in the world, sex addiction doctor on sexual addiction. I've, you know, got great videos of him and me on YouTube talking about sexual addiction. He talks about the addiction cycle, where it starts with preoccupation, where you're thinking about it, and then ritualization, where your life, all your rituals, your friends, your way you go to work, your behavior is all built, the rituals all built around it. Then the third thing is the addictive cycle is the you know, the compulsive act, the doing of the drugs, the drinking, the behavior. If it's a process addiction, the behavior addiction. And then the fourth thing is you know, shame and despair. So when you're in you know, shame and guilt, when you're in that despair space, the one thing that instantly brings you out of shame and guilt is to repeat the cycle all over again. So when you're in that ritual, I mean, it becomes a vicious cycle. You just can't, you're thinking about it, you're building your life around it. You know, the actual physical act of drinking, drugging, gambling, you know, the behavior, the food, if you're a food addict, if you're an internet addict, a screen addict, you know, it's the thinking about it that consumes most of the time. And then it puts you in a horrible place, because in most cases, an addict that feels bad or feels guilt is they're doing something that goes against their value system, and they know they're doing it, but they have lost the ability to choose. Because I don't believe addiction is a choice. I believe it's, you know, self-will run riot, you know, all that sort of stuff. And, you know, once you're in that place, it's very difficult. So yeah, I was living in that space. I mean, was I functional? Yeah. I mean, when I became a successful entrepreneur, hell, you know, I mean, I'll kind of tell you the story of what happened. So, you know, it got so bad that I looked in the mirror one day and I'm like, if I don't get the hell out of here, I'm going to die. I mean, I look like a fucking skeleton. And so, is it okay if I use profanity on this? Yeah.
Well, I mean, we're already down that road, so go right ahead. I'm a New Yorker, so, you know, that F-bomb comes out a couple times a day. So
I can minimize it if you want, for sake of. So basically, you know, I was in this bad space, and I was living with, you know, a couple roommates. And one day, one of the roommates who was doing coke every day, and I'll tell you a couple things about this individual without naming his name. He ended up getting arrested for drugs, for possession. And he was under charges of dealing. And I remember coming home one day, he was freebasing over the sink in this condo / apartment we were living at. And, all of us were doing drugs all the time. And he was, going to go to court the next morning to appear in court for cocaine possession. And he's freebasing the night before. And I'm watching this and I'm like, dude, you should probably go to bed. This is not good. I go to bed. I wake up in the morning. I go downstairs. He's over the sink in a 3-piece suit, freebasing cocaine with his lawyer waiting outside to take him to court. And it didn't register back then, but that is not choice. No person is that risky and gets off on danger that much. That is a person in a lot of mental anguish that's stressed and is just trying to scratch the fucking itch.
And this is 18 years old in a suburb in Texas.
No, that was actually in Arizona. That was in Mesa, Arizona. Yeah, because after Alpine, Texas, we moved to a different part of New Mexico. Then we ended up landing in Arizona, which is where I live today. I've been in Arizona my entire adult life, except for a couple of years when I had to leave in order to get clean and sober from doing drugs, which I'll get to that story. Yeah, I'll tell you that right now. So the same individual, a couple days later, he comes home and he busts in the front door. I'm watching TV with a friend, and he has a can of lighter fluid and just starts screaming and spraying lighter fluid all over the living room, all over me and my friend. I have lighter fluid dripping off my head. He pulls out a lighter and lights. He's like, I'm going to torch this fucking place. And I mean, screaming something out of a freaking movie. And I'm sitting there with lighter fluid all over me. If this guy throws this match down, we're all in flames. And I'm like, put that down. I'm talking this guy down. And he does. And I'm like, I've got to get the hell out of here. So I packed up all of my shit the next day, my possessions. I left everything. I left my friends. I left everything. And I drove to New Mexico. And I ended up spending 2 years living in a trailer with my father. And the first 6 months were hell because I had to get clean and sober. I didn't have any access to drugs. I didn't have any friends, but I had to get out of the environment, which, changing your environment is one of the most important things that an addict has to do in order to not only get and stay sober. There's 4 things that someone has to do, which we can talk about, that I have found that give you the highest chances of sobriety and also, staying sober.
So you did that act was basically caused by that lighter fluid incident. You decided was that the main cause of you saying to yourself, I need to get clean. I need to do something. I need to leave. Or did it take a little bit longer and a couple more events for you to get to that point?
No, there were hundreds of little events. That was one probably big, intense thing that was like, I better get that added an element of urgency to it. I mean, I knew I wanted to escape because I was using the drugs to escape. I mean, the drugs were a solution. I wanted a solution to the pain. I was just using the only thing that I knew at the time, which was doing drugs, because it worked. If you feel like crap and you want to not feel like crap, getting high, sleeping with a hooker, doing drugs, gambling, giving yourself any sort of urge. I mean, those are really, those things, they get you out of pain. But the problem is, what is addiction? Addiction is doing something you want to do or don't want to do that you cannot stop, that has negative consequences. So,
and then you still have to come back to reality. And, when you're in reality, the addiction is a challenging thing to work into that.
Yeah, no, totally. And so what happened is that probably really forced me to have to just make a choice to get the hell out of there. But I mean, looking in the mirror and seeing my sunken eyes and just seeing how bad of shape I was in, and I could barely ride a bicycle around the block. And I used to race BMX bikes, and I could barely ride a bike around the block and breathe. My lungs were so destroyed. And I had just done so much damage to my body. And so I got the hell out of there. And the first 6 months I was taking aspirin or Tylenol every day because the headaches were so severe, and it just had to go through the withdrawals. I wasn't in a hospital. I was just gutting my way through it. And, I eventually got a job at a gym selling gym memberships, and I started exercising and working out, and I ended up getting in incredibly good physical shape. in a short period of time, I met someone at the gym that ran a mental hospital in Las Cruces, New Mexico. I ended up getting a job as a mental health tech. And in this hospital, I would take the vitals of people that would come in for alcoholism, cocaine, heroin. And there was an adolescent ward and an adult ward. And I would drive the adult patients to AA meetings and NA meetings and CA meetings, which is Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous. And I would sit in on those meetings, never realizing how much impact that would have on my life, not only then, but also later in life. Because after I got clean and sober, I moved back to Arizona. My friends were blown away because I had made a complete physical transformation. I gained about 45 plus pounds. I was in really good shape, best shape of my life. And I started, a carpet cleaning business. And I have a friend from high school that talked me into, taking the money I'd saved up and started a carpet cleaning business. So I did that. And that was a struggle because I'd never ran a company before, but, I went about $30,000 in debt, running this carpet cleaning business. And there's a lot of other stuff in between that I, just for timing purposes, because my life was still a shit show.
Sure. And just to interrupt you, just to kind of put the pieces together. So you had never gone to an anonymous meeting before you started working for that facility. You had become sober completely on your own and gutting it through.
Yes.
That's amazing.
And most people don't do that. I'm a big believer in 12 steps. I'm sure I've been to 1,000 meetings over, the last, 25 plus years that I've gone to meetings. I'll be 50 years old next year. What ended up happening though, is that I associated more pain with the doing of drugs than the pleasure that I used to get out of it. And there was a time in my life where I had every sign of a full-blown drug addict or alcoholic, although alcohol was never really my biggest issue. Alcohol just helped inebriate and numb it and make it easier to make bad choices, because anything that numbs you or takes away some of your senses, you don't make as good of choices. But I didn't realize that the drugs and alcohol were not my core addiction. My core addiction was actually sex addiction, which didn't manifest until a little bit after I had come back to Arizona and trying to figure out how to do relationships. And when I was molested as a kid, my father, never remarried after my mother died. I never had any introduction to healthy relationships or what true healthy intimacy was. And so my introduction to sexuality, relationships was very unhealthy. My father was very resentful that he lost the love of his life. So I didn't hear anything positive about how relationships are loving and wonderful. All I saw was pain. And when you have that sort of model, you don't know how to build healthy models. I mean, who's going to teach that to you if your environment and your parents and your caretakers are, very unhealthy?
Right. And it sounds like you couldn't talk to him. I mean, you couldn't share what you were going through.
No.
It just wasn't that type of relationship, and based on what I'm hearing.
No, not at all. I can't remember any adults in my childhood that I could look at and say they were really instrumental in helping me. Because a lot of people ask, how'd you get out of it? What was the shit? I don't know. I think I learned most of it just through reading books, because I'm a huge reader. I've read over 1,000 books, and I would, find books, music, and self-help. Early on I would listen to Earl Nightingale and listen to Tony Robbins and motivate. And then now, I ended up creating the #1 selling marketing program in the world at Nightingale Conant many years later. And Tony Robbins is a dear friend of mine. So, I now know a lot of these people personally that I used to listen and read their books. And
it was meant to be. You manifested it, right? You started at an early age reading about him, and here he is on your wildly successful program. But maybe if you could just tie in where you kind of just stopped into the recovery portion.
Yeah. Okay. So once I moved away and
the entrepreneurial portion, because it seemed like it was like almost a natural transition, and you almost, your friend suggested, hey, go into the carpet business. And you said, I'm going to do it. And you went that way, and all of a sudden you're an entrepreneur without probably even knowing it.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, the definition of an entrepreneur, the first recorded use of the word entrepreneur was in 1804 by a French guy named John Baptiste Say, that said an entrepreneur is an individual that takes resources from a lower yield to a higher yield. Basically, takes resources from a lower level of productivity to a higher level. And most entrepreneurs are just solving problems for a profit, trying to figure out how to make a living. So I had a friend from high school who talked me into starting the carpet cleaning business, and we were partners for just a few months, but he would get drunk almost nightly. And so I eventually had to take his name off our partnership thing. And here I was stuck with some chemicals and equipment and a business card that said I was a professional carpet cleaner, trying to figure out how the hell to make this business work. So I won't go into the long, painful story there, but I spent 2 years bumbling my way through doing hard manual labor, trying to figure it out, trying to piece it all together, dealing with the wreckage of my past, dealing with some still very dysfunctional relationships that I still had, that when I was in the doing of drugs world, I had to establish, whole new relationships, and also try to pay my bills. And so I went about $30,000 in debt, working my ass off, and I learned marketing, not because I ever wanted to, but out of necessity, because I needed to eat, I needed to survive. And I got really good at understanding psychology, because marketing is really applied psychology. I think I learned more by the study of marketing about the human mind than even going to therapists and reading psychology books. And so when I did go away, also I went to New Mexico State for a couple of years, but just in between. And I was I had jobs before I got the job at the gym and everything. But I never got a degree in anything. I mean, even in high school, the night of my high school graduation, which was at Dobson High School in Mesa, Arizona, instead of walking during the ceremony, I actually was freebasing cocaine in the backyard of one of my friends' houses that backed up to the football stadium where they were having the graduation ceremony. That's how disconnected I was.
Wow.
during my high school graduation. And of course, my father was kind of disconnected also. So it held no real importance of walking and doing the ceremony as a graduate. So I was pretty screwed up. So anyway, going back to my carpet cleaning business, I learned marketing. I became very good at it. I turned this small carpet cleaning business around. I started selling the same methodologies to other carpet cleaners using education-based marketing, very ethical, very effective. No one in the world had created what it is that I had done. And I started teaching it to other people, and lo and behold, it worked. And so the first year I started selling $497 courses, $597 courses. I had a basic and a gold version. I sold $250,000 worth of my 250-page manual and audio cassette tapes and VHS tapes on how to build and grow a professional cleaning business with all kinds of different, very effective marketing strategies. And, in a matter of a couple of years, I became the most well-known person in the world in that industry, and sold a lot of stuff. The second year, I sold $500,000 worth of these courses. By the third year, I was, selling over $1 million a year, and I became a millionaire by the time I was 30 years old, teaching carpet and upholstery cleaners how to build and grow their businesses. Now,
wow. So all of that happened to you up to 30 years old. Addict, out of control, didn't care about yourself, didn't care about people around you, most likely, didn't care about graduation for sure, to a self-made millionaire by 30.
Yeah. Yeah. And by the way, I did actually, I always cared about other people. There's a side of me that's probably codependent, which is another form of addiction, where I would, very much care about other people, almost to a fault at times, where I would even caretake people that were, really not very, very caring themselves, I guess, outright, non-reciprocal and bad to me. That being said, though, once I didn't know how to do relationships, though. And let me define, as I go into this stuff, my favorite definition of intimacy was shared with me by a 70-year-old guy who I never met in person, just over the phone, who actually spends his time helping people that have sexual addictions. And he said that intimacy is a mutual exploration of a shared safe place, a mutual exploration of a shared safe place. Abuse is anything that takes away the safe place, and addictions are what we do to make ourselves feel good when we don't have a safe place. So in my life, I never felt safe. I was always trying to get away from this dark cloud that was chasing me. I was always in a hurry to be somewhere. And as soon as I got to wherever I was in a hurry to be, I was in a hurry to get somewhere else. And that ended up becoming a very difficult, stressful way to live. And so I wanted to medicate and escape from that. And so I didn't know how to do relationships. So I was very toxic. I was very, and when I say toxic, I wasn't like mean in terms of physically abusive. I was emotionally, not very developed. I didn't know how to interact with women. I was scared of it. And so I would get into these kind of screwed up relationships. And I had, my first girlfriends, they all cheated on me. One girl that I really connected with, one of my best friends, ended up getting her really drunk and they slept together. I mean, so I had all this dysfunctional stuff going on. And my first, girlfriend, it was, for a long-term one, it ended up being the same sort of stuff. I introduced her to someone, she ended up sleeping with him. And then, so this shit's all going on early in my 20s as I'm building and growing my business. Even though I'm learning how to make money, I'm having these, very dysfunctional love relationships. And I ended up, being in a relationship for 6 years, which ended with, me wanting to separate and then finding out that she was pregnant. And so I ended up staying with a woman who I didn't want to be with for, the course of her giving birth and then trying to, raise this child together in the beginning of the relationship, and then her wanting to move out of state with the child, although I was fully supporting her and the child and running my company. And she mentioned she wanted to move out of state, so I joined a father's rights group. And this was back in 1997. And in 1998, period of time. And basically, I joined a father's rights group because I didn't want her to leave with our child. And they're like, what do you want to have happen? I said, well, I just want us to be able to both raise the child together. So I started pursuing a case of where I would pursue sole custody with 50-50 visitations rights, since I was, supporting her and the child. And I found out through a DNA test that they wanted me to take because it would help me with custody. 5 days before this child's first birthday, I found out that I was not the biological father. And,
Wow.
and it just crushed me. So I offered to adopt the child because I was now scared about the livelihood of this child. And I offered, she didn't want to do that. And I offered her $100,000 if she would let me adopt a child and sign away all paternal rights, which she didn't want to do. And
How old were you at this point?
well, that was 20. It was 20 years ago. So, I'm 49 now. I'll be 50 next year. So that was,
So you were about 30, 29, 30. So you were bringing in money. So you had money at that time. So you could kind of do that, or you were going to figure out how to get it.
No, I was a business rock star during that time.
Okay.
I mean, I was so good at that time that had I not had this trauma, I probably would have been one of these guys that was worth God knows how many millions of dollars. But I was
Now,
but that's it. The money is irrelevant. The pain that I experienced, I would have paid every penny I had to not have gone through that shit.
Oh, 100%. It's not until we go through that amount of trauma, that amount of addiction, that amount of, mental anguish, for me, that you realize that money is not going to solve any of those problems at all. And in some instances, it makes it a lot worse.
That's totally it. I mean, having access to money allows you to buy anything that your twisted, addictive brain can conjure up in terms of, so what ended up happening was all those relationships, even getting into that relationship, was a reaction to untreated trauma, which is what addiction is,
Right.
In my opinion, in my perspective.
So how were you able to go through these, ups and downs and mentally stay sane? Was there any, were you creating any positive habits on a daily basis? I know you mentioned you put weight on, you were working out. Were you working out throughout this time to have like a outlet? What were you doing? Cause you're sober now, right? But you're going through all this crazy shit anyway, because, we know how to create chaos in our lives.
Well, yeah. Well, see, look, yeah, like you just said, the addict mind doesn't seek harmony; it seeks chaos until you get into a state of recovery where you start seeking serenity, where you start seeking peace, where you start seeking true connection, not artificial connection. So after that happened, uh, I was broken. I mean, it just derailed me. It was the worst mental pain and anguish I'd ever experienced up to that point in my life. And so the only thing that made the pain go away was to have sex with a lot of women. So the real addiction started. The drug addiction was just a numbing mechanism. The real addiction was a connection disorder. It was sexual addiction. And so that just exasperated it. And I was doing well during that time when, the child, I was going to meetings, I was making sure I was, engaged in recovery. And that happened, and the world didn't make any sense to me anymore. I remember, a few months after that happened, her father called me on the phone, and I had taken 2 DNA tests because I wanted to check the first one too. And he, calls me on the phone. He's like, "We know what you've done, young man. You're going to pay for what you've done. We're going to get you." And I'm listening to this like, this is the worst form of betrayal that anyone's ever done to me. I paid over $50,000 to support this woman in a year's time. I treated her as good as I could to a very antagonistic woman who had done the worst lie that anyone could ever have done to me at that point in my life. And I have her father telling me that I'm going to pay for what I've done, and they're going to get me because of whatever fucking story she had told him. And the world just didn't make sense. So what did I do? I started sleeping with a lot of escorts and prostitution, and I was just trying to get connection. I didn't understand it at the time, but I wanted love. I wanted connection. I was a young male. I wanted to, be sexual. But every form of sexuality, people lied to me. They betrayed me. It was abusive. And so I ended up becoming a very functional addict. I still maintained $1 million a year business, but I got involved in some very toxic relationships with a lot of crazy shit happening. And I turned my company over to a woman who embezzled somewhere between $50,000 to $200,000 from me. We don't even know the amount because the forensic accounting would have cost as much to perform that as she stole from me. And,
Yep.
and I ended up getting into, another really toxic relationship, and it eventually accumulated with me joining a high profile group in the early 2000s where I was with, famous Academy Award winning actors and actresses, NBA players, NFL players, famous politicians, famous musicians that I grew up listening to their music, a couple billionaires, and, people that the whole world would know. And I sat and watched people and interacted and became friends with people, which I'll, never mention their names for confidentiality reasons. The whole world would know these people, but they couldn't go out publicly and admit their addictions. And so I got to see another side of how bad addiction can take. And there's incredible people doing incredible things that people have no idea the silent battles that these people are fighting, and that their fame and notoriety and their success in many ways is driven by the deep pain and trauma that they're trying to overcome. So, workaholism is the respectable addiction. And there's performance addiction is a big one. There's a lot of, one of my projects is Artists for Addicts, where, we look at all the famous artists that have created amazing bodies of work that they've put out in the world, but they die due to their, untreated addictions and mental illnesses and stuff. And so that's one of the things that, we're doing is, using art as a force for good, and using that to raise money to build our educational platform with it, which is geniusrecovery.com to, educate people on all the different forms of treatment that have efficacy and that sort of stuff. But, so looking back, I spent a couple of decades where I would run big events. I'd do events where people would change their lives, and I would, end the event with a big adrenaline rush, and I didn't have any outlet for it. So I would go and act out sexually. And, now in my adult life, I'm doing better than I ever have in my recovery because I've done a lot of stuff. And I will tell you, that being said, I never try to present myself as like an expert or that I got my shit together. And there's not a day that goes by where I don't think about being molested as a kid. And, it's even with $500,000 that I've spent on my own recovery, and probably $500,000 spent on my addiction, you know. So I'm fortunate because I've learned how to make money, and a lot of people don't have the access to those resources and stuff. So what I try to do is just take a look at, man, I was able to accomplish a lot of stuff being in a very dysfunctional state. I mean, how would I do if I wasn't, and how well would people do if they could, take this monkey, this obsession off their back? So yeah, but I've done a lot of stuff, and I'm happy to talk about all those things, but it got very dark, and I had to go through a whole series of a lot of pain, but I think I wouldn't be talking to you here right now today if all that shit had not happened. So I have on some levels, a sense of gratitude for it. I've done my best to make amends to anyone that I've harmed along the way. Thankfully, the shit that was done to me as a child, I've never ever gotten near to those levels of being a perpetrator or abusing people like it was done to me. And the challenging thing is that people that are hurt others if they don't get treatment, if they don't do something about it. And so I have a real empathy and a real compassion for people, even when they're doing fucked up things, because I know that most humans, me, you, everyone, whatever I'm thinking, whatever I'm saying right now is just my current level of consciousness. And if I can increase that level of consciousness a little bit, I'll do better. And the same thing with people. So, when I see all these people that are out there, addicts are difficult creatures. I mean, they lie, they cheat, they steal, they hurt themselves, they hurt other people. They're very difficult to deal with. But if people could understand that, they're in pain, and the same stuff that they're doing to others was probably done to them, in many cases worse, doesn't excuse bad behavior when it gets to the level of abuse and violence. However, it does make it understandable. And if you don't understand the causation of something, it makes it very hard to know how to prevent it or how to treat it. And so the real thing, which if I could wave a magic wand, I would want to be able to help get to the children before they become full-blown addicts. But you see these children in foster homes, you see all these children that are abused. I mean, what do you think is going to happen with them if they don't get treatment? They're going to grow up and they're going to become the same thing. I mean, people give love the same way that love was given to them, unless they learn a different way to, give and receive love. And so
Sure.
that's why communities like 12 Steps are so important. And, you're as sick as your secrets, and if you rotting food in the fridge doesn't get better with age, it gets worse. And so, being able to disclose, being able to walk into rooms where people believe in you more than you believe in yourself, hope heals, and being able to find that sort of stuff is critical. And luckily, even in the worst states, I always had a part of me that was curious, and I just wanted to get better. Even when I didn't know what the hell I was doing, even when I felt hopeless, even when I felt suicidal, which, has happened thousands of times in my brain. I just didn't want to exist anymore. I mean, even when I was successful in making money and had people admire me, I'd be like, God, what is wrong with me? Like, why can't I feel satiated with anything? And what happens with addicts is they become pleasure deaf.
Yep.
It's just the normal things like going for a walk, going to a movie, doing something, hanging out. You just want to jump out of your own skin, and you need a, and the problem is if you keep reinforcing the behavior, normal things that most people would find pleasurable bore an addict to tears. They need that adrenaline rush. They need that surge. And so finding alternative ways to get the serotonin, the dopamine is tough. And most addicts find it through addiction.
Yeah. No, I mean, I can relate to that firsthand. And, when I came off of my gambling addiction, all of a sudden I had all this time on my hands. I mean, like you said, every single day for me, I would wake up thinking about gambling. I would be working. I was a kick-ass salesman too. Funny, we're both salesmen, right? I find that type A personality in a lot of addicts. All day I'd be thinking about gambling, researching gambling while I was at work, going to the bookie across town to pay him while I had a meeting, and thinking about what I was going to bet on at night, watching what I bet on at night, and then doing it all over again the next day. So, all of a sudden you have all this time and you have to fill in that time. For me, I was able to transfer it to what I thought was a healthy addiction, which I started running. So I ran 4 marathons in 5 years until I had back surgery, and I had to stop that. But then again, I had this complete gap of time. All of a sudden, I couldn't run like I was running. I was sober from gambling. What was I going to do next? So did you ever have any big time gaps where you had to, create other activities positive in your life to fill the amount of time you were taking with either your sex addiction or, let's move on to the sex addiction, with your sex addiction, when you were able to kind of come off of that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I certainly always kept myself busy, because if it wasn't sex, it was work, it was performance addiction, it was trying to get admiration. I mean, uh, I run the highest level marketing group in the world. I mean, all my clients are, very successful financially. And what I try to do is sell people what they want, give them what they need. Most people that hire me or listen to my podcast or come to my courses, they want to make more money. And I certainly, have helped people become millionaires. I work with people that are running, I've clients that are billionaires. I mean, I work with a lot of high level people. And what I try to get through to a lot of them is like, do you realize that the world advances on the backs of its neurotics? And although you're doing some great shit in the world, I mean, you're a pain body. Your back hurt, your neck hurts. I mean, I think the same manifestations of physical pain are the same things that cause addiction. I mean, it's repressed emotions, and it needs a way to express itself. So there's a huge link between entrepreneurship and addiction. One thing that really became apparent to me, I got to share this with you, because it does, to me, it makes all the sense in the world, is I was speaking earlier this year. I have a friend, Vern Harnish, who wrote Scale Up, the Rockefeller Habits. He created EO, which started as YEO, Young Entrepreneurs Organization. Now it's EO, Entrepreneurs Organization. And so he invited me to be one of the speakers at his Fortune summit. He does a Scale Up summit with Fortune magazine, and it was in San Antonio, Texas. And the night before, I had dinner with Graham Weston, who's the founder of Rackspace, who's a billionaire, and he had recently sold Rackspace for $4.2 billion. And we spent the dinner talking about addiction, and he was like, found it very interesting, me talking about the link between entrepreneurs and addicts. And so the next day, there's 1,000 people in the audience. The average company there is a $20 million a year company, so we're very successful businesses. And I spend an hour and 15 minutes talking. I brought one of my friends and clients up on stage with me, and talked for about an hour and 15 minutes about business and marketing. In that hour and 15 minutes, I spent probably 2 minutes talking about addiction and what I want to do about change the global conversation about how people view and treat addicts with compassion instead of judgment, and to find the best forms of treatment that have efficacy. And I talked about being an addict and weighing 105 pounds. I just mentioned it real briefly. So that was early on the first day. And during the rest, and we gave everybody a copy of my pre-release version of my book, which still isn't out yet. And everyone loved the speech. But over the next 2 days, 9 out of 10 people that came up to me, and I talked to 100 to 200 people personally, one-on-one. 9 out of 10 people that came up to me mentioned addiction, not business. And it dawned on me like, holy shit, if I was just some addiction guy talking about addiction, there's no way I would be invited to an event to speak at a thing like that.
Right.
And if I was just a business guy, they sure as hell ain't going to invite me to an addiction conference with doctors. But I'm a guy that goes to both of these things. And it finally made sense to me that there's all these entrepreneurs pursuing self-help and seminars and books, trying to find, looking for love in all the wrong places. They're thinking business is going to resolve their pain. And they actually, look, you can argue it's better to build a successful company that puts out good products and services to the world and, allows you to, be as financially successful than to be a strung out addict on the streets. However, the mechanisms that are driving people are very similar. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, that wrote the book Flow, said that the same neural pathways that a top performer, artist, athlete gets into a state of flow are the same neural pathways that an addict uses for self-destruction. So we're using the same brain waves. It's just one leads to massive achievement and performance. The other leads to massive self-destruction. So we're using the same roads. It's just one drives us into hell. The other drives us to non-hell, I guess. So, yeah. That's sort of the deal. So along the way, it's a mixed bag. I had great times. I did some great stuff, but it wasn't until I really started putting together all the pieces, and this is the first time in my adult life where I'm finally feeling a sense of real deep appreciation for who I am as a person, the value that I put out into the world, that I give more than I take, that I produce more than I consume, that I'm able to take my marketing skills and I'm able to share messages like this because, I don't make any money off of this shit yet. I don't know if I ever will. And it's a trade-off. And I'm talking about something that isn't very enjoyable. It's not pleasurable talking about, I spend half my time now talking to people whose, family members, daughters, brothers, sisters, mothers, cousins, friends have addictions, from opiate addictions to sexual addictions to every sort of addiction. It's very painful. I'm talking about stuff that people can misinterpret when I say things like sexual addiction and, manufacture whatever stories about me, and, putting yourself out there isn't, doesn't make you look really cool. However, I can't leave it alone. I have a calling for this, and there's a lot of people that are suffering. And I think it would be a travesty to have the platform and the skills that I have and not try to share my story so that at least people realize that you're as sick as your secrets. And if you don't disclose stuff and put it out there, it give other people permission to say, hey man, I feel fucked up. I'm not doing well. And I'm doing, most people between the ages of 14 to, hell, it even goes way into adulthood, spend, minutes or hours a day glued to a screen, looking at porn, looking at more hits, more validations, more little dopamine hits, gambling, gaming. All of the shit. And people carry around their phones like it's a third limb. And if we are in addiction is in the worst, states it's ever been in human history. We'll probably have 100,000 people, many that won't even be reported, that will die of opiate addictions this year.
Yeah. And not to cut you off, but that's why it is such an important topic to be talking about. And I commend you and everything that you've done to bring it to light, because I'm part of a lot of entrepreneur organizations as well. One is similar to EO, called YEC, which is the Young Entrepreneurial Council. And when I start talking about these things one-on-one, people will open up. But when you start putting it out on a public platform, people will crawl into a hole. So I haven't always talked about it. It took me several years, actually, to admit that I was an addict. Several years after I was recovering, for me to be okay to say to somebody I'm an addict, to me to be able to say to my parents, I'm gambling addiction, or to my friends. And one of the things that I found imperative was, they always talk about people, places, and things. Right. Mm-hmm. And you have to change the people that you surround yourself with. You have to change the places you hang out in, and you cannot do the same things that have led to this dysfunctional behavior. Right. And, so transitioning from that to entrepreneurship, what similar traits have you seen? Because you mentioned earlier that, you were part of this high level network, and you are, attending all these events with all these, high net worth individuals who are high achievers, and you could see addiction right in front of you. So what common traits have you been able to identify over the years between the addict and between the entrepreneur?
Oh, shitloads. Many are, they're driven, they're resourceful, because in order to be, like you mentioned, sales, well, selling, you have to be a really good salesperson in order to manipulate yourself through life and live a double life. You have to be very convincing, and you have to convince yourself, so the number one sales job that people in a good way or bad way have to do is the sales job they do on themselves. Now, my favorite definition of selling came from Dan Sullivan, who I consider the smartest entrepreneur thinker I've ever met. And I've, met some of the top entrepreneurs on the planet. And Dan, I've been in his program for 20 years called Strategic Coach. He's one of my dear friends. We do a podcast together called 10X Talk. And, basically, one of the things with Dan is that, it's the problem is not the problem. The problem is how you think about the problem. And so when I asked him, how do you define selling? He said, sales is getting someone intellectually engaged in a future result that's good for them and getting them to emotionally commit to take action to achieve that result. Now, if you take out the word good for them, you can get someone intellectually engaged in a future result and get them to commit to take action to do that. Well, so we're always selling. Everything that comes out of my mouth, your mouth, anyone's mouth is designed to attract and to repel. And there are incredible traits of even some of the biggest con artists and the biggest scoundrels. They can be very driven. They can be very like goal-oriented. They could be very strategic. So there's a line that I haven't done anything with the URL. I like the line so much, I actually registered the website a few years ago, but it's winnersfindways.com. Nothing's even on there. It's just like, I just own the URL. And I always thought about winners find ways and losers find ways. In order to win in life, win in business, win in anything, sports, music, arts, whatever, parenting, there are ways that you go about strategically. Everything has a strategy. I don't believe in good habits or bad habits. If someone wakes up every day, drinks 2 cups of coffee, smokes a joint, kicks their dog, yells at their spouse, eats 2 Egg McMuffins, you can say that person has bad habits, but I'm like, no, they've actually got really good habits of doing all that shit because they're consistently doing it. So, winners find ways, losers find ways. Addicts find ways to have all kinds of things done in a certain way that fuck up their lives. And people that do recovery find strategies. They find tools of recovery. So there's a lot to be said about entrepreneurship and addiction. And obsessive entrepreneurs, the ones that become the $100 million plus, the billionaires, these are usually not very connected to normal people sort of individuals. They're operating in a whole nother spirit. I luckily have been around a lot of them. And a lot of them are wonderful people, and a lot of them are lopsided losers with a shitload of money, and they're really good at the money game, but they don't have, I remember this story that this neurotic, crazy, but brilliant copywriter named Gary Halbert, who actually I first learned marketing from, he would tell this story about how this guy came to one of his seminars years ago, and he was, running a multi-million-dollar hardware business of hardware stores years ago. This is probably like 30 years ago. And the guy had 56 hardware stores. He was, 60 pounds overweight. His cholesterol was through the roof. He'd not spoken to his children for a couple of years. He was in the middle of going through a divorce. And his number one goal was to open up his 57th hardware store. Now, his priorities were a little messed up, right?
Yeah, just a little bit.
Yeah. But you know what? That's not, if you get really into people's lives, it's not all that abnormal. I mean, a lot of people, they're looking for love in all the wrong places. And so the link, you can be a very, Hitler got people intellectually and emotionally engaged in killing people. Pornography companies, tobacco companies have very strategic entrepreneurial principles, but most entrepreneurs are amazing people that want to create value in the world, that work really hard, and they get vilified unfairly by a lot of society, because for every bad entrepreneur that's out there, if you want to even call them that, for every person who's exploitive, who's putting shitty things out into the world, there's thousands that are just trying to do a good job. And in order to, create, money earned ethically is a byproduct of value creation, and recovery is also about value creation. Recovery is about being able to walk into a place where you feel hopeless, but you're operating from courage, because nothing feels good in the middle. When you're in the middle of trying to figure out recovery, confidence is not there. Connection in many cases is not there. The only thing you can do is muster courage. And mustering courage doesn't feel good, but it's necessary in order to walk into that room and to basically sit down and admit that you are powerless or that you are broken, and to have people that are there that believe in you more than you believe in yourself. Hope heals. And when you feel so fucked up that you don't know what to do, if you can go volunteer, which 12 steps is a form of volunteering. If someone's an anti-12-step person, on Genius Recovery, we've put a whole slew of different communities, 12 steps. If someone's an atheist and they hate even talking about God, there's communities that you can go. If you're in the Zen recovery, if you're in the Smart recovery, but the point is find a community. And so, what I'd like to do is talk about some of the things that I have found, because I've been traveling around the world for the last couple of years with a video crew, filming stuff for our documentaries and for our stuff that we put out on Genius Recovery, talking to addicts, talking to doctors, me doing the craziest things. I mean, I'm playing my own human lab rat. I mean, I'm the first person in the world to have before and after brain scans after doing ibogaine and 5-MeO DMT, which are plant medicines, and ibogaine is the most powerful psychedelic in the world. And I'm not an opiate addict. However, it's one of the most effective ways to treat opiate addictions if administered in the right way. It's illegal in the United States, so I had to go to Mexico into a clinic in Tijuana, and I did blood tests with serotonin and dopamine, filmed the whole thing, did brain scans with Dr. Daniel Amen, who is a friend who has scanned the brains of more addicts and NFL players than anyone else in the world. And he interprets what my brain was like before, what my brain was after. I've had my brain scanned 6 different times. So I've learned a lot about what the brain, the brains of addicts are different than the brains of non-addicts. Daniel Amen says, psychiatry is the only profession that doesn't look at the organ that it treats. And so, and if you were to look at the brain scans of serial killers, you would rethink the death penalty. And so, there's sick brain things. So I've been traveling around recording a lot of stuff, and I've learned that in order to get sober and stay sober, there are certain things that if you do all of these, they give you the highest possibility of sobriety. And I've incorporated and do incorporate those things into my life on a daily basis as much as humanly possible.
So you're talking about behavioral, behavioral traits, or actual, I know you don't like to use the word habits, but like actual action that you're taking that has been proven through these scientific studies that you've been a part of to actually benefit you, and you're kind of testing those out in your own life.
Well, yeah, and plus I'm recording it and sharing it with people. So I'm recording my research as much as I can.
That's great. And where can people see that?
Geniusrecovery.com is our educational platform, which is all in startup stages. There's a lot of videos. There's hundreds of resources from. And it's all free. I mean, we're currently not selling anything there. It's just, there's a great interview at the very beginning, an open letter to people struggling with addiction, that if people want to, what do you say to a family member? If you're an addict yourself, how do you think about this? So I have a letter up there that really kind of goes into what is addiction, how do people think about it. I even have a copy of it right here, an open letter to anyone struggling with addiction. And then I have a great interview with JP Sears, the funny comedian guy, which is actually an hour and 20-minute serious interview right here where I'm sitting right now, one of my rooms in my home, where me and JP, he's a dear friend, we just did a Facebook Live. And at the time, something like 60-something thousand people watched it. And then we put it online. Ariana Huffington put it on Thrive Global. And now, a couple 100,000 people have watched it. And it's literally me going through a lot of stuff on addiction, saying some of the things that I've talked about here. And then I've got interviews with different people that are alcoholics and doctors and all kinds of resources. Where do you find community? So the 4 things that I have found, and a lot of this, Tommy Rosen, who's a great, he wrote a book called Recovery 2.0, dear friend. He's the one that even got me thinking about these 4 areas. But there's 4 ways to treat addiction. And I say all of this hoping that several years from now, everything I'm saying will be obsolete and we will have found far better ways. Because the way that we treat addicts right now in the world is like in the medieval days. I mean, it's the modern form of human slavery. I mean, the way that, who's treating most addicts right now, it's not doctors or a compassionate industry. As a matter of fact, doctors are some of the biggest culprits to getting people continuing to stay addicted. The criminal justice system is who's treating addiction, and it needs to be taken out of the hands of the criminal justice system, because even as much as a person wants to try to stop addicts, you cannot punish the pain out of people. And throwing people in cages that are already traumatized individuals and associating bad behavior with badness is not the right way to treat addicts. So we're literally throwing humans in cages, and many of them have done bad shit. So, again, addicts lie, they cheat, they steal, they do awful stuff. Some of them hurt others. But again, people that hurt others are hurt themselves in most cases. And so, so part of what I'm about to say is not only these are some things to do, but how you think about it. You know, the problem is not the problem. The problem is how you think about the problem. And if you think that addicts are just moral degenerates that need to be punished and thrown and locked away, you're not solving anything, nothing. You're just making it worse. The war on drugs, which was a dismal failure, just maybe they had the intention right, which was stop the craziness, but you don't, the war on drugs is like a war on addicts.
Sure.
You know, it's like saying a war on cancer patients. If someone's got cancer, you're going to just start locking them up and throwing them in prison, and somehow that's going to get them well? No, it's going to actually make them worse because you're stressing them out. So there's four.
And it's also, just before you get into those four things, it's also, it's a lot different if you're of low income. And you're an addict, okay? And because those people are getting thrown in jail. They have no other options. Versus what we're kind of leaning towards our topic of being an entrepreneur and being an addict.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you get busted with something as an entrepreneur, a lot of times you can pay your way out of it, right? But you can't do that when you're in the low income arena. So, you know, I'd like you to discuss the four things that you're about to, and if there's any correlation or tie-in with entrepreneurship, you know, that would be even better.
Well, look, in order to be a really good criminal, that's, you know, there's a lot of great entrepreneurs that are criminal minds, right? So, and they just are, a lot of them are great salespeople, and, you know, to be a great, number one job of an entrepreneur is to go get a check. And if you can't get a check and make money, you know, you're not going to be successful as an entrepreneur. Hopefully you're making money ethically by creating value. But a lot of people that are kind of conny or manipulative or whatever, they're very self-serving. And I believe life gives to the giver and takes from the taker. So the more that I can help inspire people to produce more than they consume, all the better. And, you know, be nice to the people you meet on the way up, because they're the same people you meet on the way down. So for me, I have a whole operating principle. As we speak, yesterday or the day before, a big article came out on Forbes about me called the Magic Rapport Formula, where I actually talk about how to develop relationships with people in a very authentic, very caring, giving way. But based on what you said about low income, let me touch on something there because it's important. And I won't have all these stats exactly right. They change on a daily basis. But currently in the United States, we have between 2.2 and 2.3 million people that are incarcerated. 25% of the world's prisoners are in the United States. Approximately 0.91% of the U.S. population is incarcerated. We're the highest incarcerating country in the world. Again, 25% of the entire prisoners in the world are incarcerated in America. 4,750,000 people are currently on probation or parole, depending on what neighborhoods, what cities you go to, and you look around at groups of people. 3 to 5 out of every 100 people are a criminal in this country. 80 to 90% of all people that are arrested, it was under the influence of drugs or alcohol. That doesn't even factor in behavioral addictions, because if you were to take that, everyone's under the influence of some sort of stress, some sort of crazy behavior, texting behind the wheel, you know, anger, sleep deprived, caffeinated through the roof, you know, eating shitty food, looking at porn in some sort of dissociative state. And you've got, and the reason that we have so much racism is because of the war on drugs. And if someone wants to argue that, read the book Chasing the Scream by Johann Hari to get a good perspective of the war on drugs and how it started, and how, you know, it was started by Harry Anslinger, who was known to be a massive racist, and he pretty much was the one that kind of started what became the war on drugs in America, and because he hated blacks and he hated Hispanics, and he needed a way to basically punish them. Tells a story about how, you know, he's probably responsible for killing Billie Holiday, while Judy Garland, who was white, you know, who was also a heroin addict, got proper treatment, whereas Billie Holiday was, you know, not allowed to have drugs and died of withdrawals. And so, you know, the thing, and I meet with politicians. I mean, we're trying to get a bill presented in Arizona where we take first-time offenders that have not committed a violent crime, to go to treatment instead of prison or jail, because once they're in prison and jail, they're in the system. They not only does it, they can't get student loans, they can't vote, but they now have a scarlet letter, and you have the emotional wreckage of what that does to a person's already low self-esteem by throwing them in jail. But see, like I live in Scottsdale, Arizona currently, and I've talked to past mayors of the city here in Arizona. I won't name the one because he's like my political advisor to me. But he said, we couldn't go make busts in, yuppie town Scottsdale, because if we arrested those people, they could always get off. So they would always instruct us, the powers that be, to go and, basically do drug busts in lower income neighborhoods where there's more minorities. And he said, there's no way to enforce drug laws, even if you're not a racist, without it being a race issue, because it always defaults to lower income people are the ones that stay in jail and prison. So why do we have so much racism here? It's because of drug laws. It's because of drugs. It's because it is impossible to enforce fairly based on socioeconomic things, because some people can defend themselves and others cannot. And that's and that's a whole nother complicated issue. But the thing is, this
we could talk for days about that, and you're right. And there definitely needs to be something done there. So it's great that you're putting some efforts towards that. If we could just shift it back just a little bit to that kind of entrepreneurial mindset, what advice would you give to young entrepreneurs who have an addictive personality? They may have a one of the typical addictions that we have, they may not, but more and more, there are more entrepreneurs now than ever. There will continue to be more entrepreneurs. What advice would you give to that younger generation that's in that kind of state?
For one, I would say learn to meditate or get yourself into a flow state, because the pursuit of external validation, like I go on stages, I have lots of people that listen to me. I'm an insecure, flawed, scared human being that just wants the world to admire me and make me feel that I'm okay. I know where a lot of the drive comes from, and I've come to grips with some of that. And there's healthy ways to use your ego, and there's unhealthy ways. The advice that I would give is be nice to the people you meet on the way up. They're going to be the same people you meet on the way down. Lay down with dogs, wake up with fleas. Focus on your health, making money, building businesses, having nice cars and nice houses and all of that shit. I mean, I've had all of those things. I've lived in multi-million-dollar houses. I'm getting ready to sell a home that I spent $1 million remodeling, and it was a pain in the ass. I realized that I didn't own that house. That house owned me, because the number one thing to protect as an entrepreneur is your attention. What gets your attention? Where does it go? What value output is created? Protect your confidence. It's really hard to do anything well if you're not operating from a state of confidence, but most entrepreneurs are not going to be operating with confidence when they first don't know what it is they're doing, because, an entrepreneur's life is make it up and make it real, because you don't know what the hell you're doing half the time. So seek out books and courses and people that have been there, done that. Be very careful to take advice from people that haven't done what it is they're giving it advice on. There's many people that are successful, and there's many people that are reporters of success, where they'll talk about success principles, but to do it in the real world is a whole nother thing. Also, you don't develop a great reputation by talking about what you're going to do. You build a great reputation by actually doing shit. So, and finally, you can have all the money, all of the relationship, all the access, living in a wonderful country like America. And if you're ungrateful, you're not going to feel any joy out of it. So you have to focus on gratitude. So all of the fundamental things that you'll see people write about all the time, like, journal, I'm almost done with co-authoring a book with Hal Elrod and Anna David called The Miracle Morning for Addiction Recovery, where we're going through all of the rituals on what.
I was just going to ask you, you must have been reading my mind. I was just going to transition into, what your morning, how you start your morning off. So I'll let you continue.
Well, I'll tell you real quickly. I mean, I meditate. I do transcendental meditation. I either before or after, I do at least a minimum of 30 burpees. So I do between 30 to 120 burpees every single day.
They'll get you.
I hate them. They suck. But man, you can put yourself into a state and, start off with one if you can only do one. Then the next day do two. And in a month, you'll be doing 30 a day. And if you're traveling a lot, get a workout in. A great line for anyone, not just entrepreneurs, but it's a proverb that he or she who has their health has 1,000 dreams. He who does not have their health has only one. And so the reason you're able to have entrepreneurial aspirations and you're able to pursue goals and you're able to build a business, you're able to listen to us right now talking is because, or watching us or however the hell they're consuming this, is you're not laid up in a hospital bed dying. And, you know, I spoke to a group of a couple thousand people a few months ago. I was at a big conference in San Diego, and I asked the audience, and for some reason this resonated with people. I said, hey, how many people in the room here are worth $1 million? You know, so a few people raised their hand. Is anyone here worth over 10 million? You know, one person raised their hand. I said, anyone, you know, worth 100 million? No one raised their hand. I said, how many of you would like to be millionaires? Because I was there to talk about how to, you know, do what I call genius networking, developing a network of geniuses, because that's what I do best. And so I said, you know, how many of you would like to be millionaires? You know, a whole bunch of hands go up. I go, okay. How many of you right now would give me your eyeballs for $1 million? Like, no one raises their hand. Like, anyone gouge out your eyeballs and give them to me for 10 million? Maybe 100 million? Anyone give me $1 billion for your eyeballs? No one raised their hand. I go, huh. I go, what about your tongue? Maybe cut out your tongue, give me your tongue, or maybe lop off those thumbs of yours, or anyone, you know, cut off your ears, you know, so you can't hear. Anyone do that? No one would raise their hand. I'm like, well, it's pretty interesting. Everyone here wants to make $1 million, and you think you don't have anything, and you're walking around with this wonderful thing called vision and sight and sound, and you know, you have thumbs and all this, and you just take for granted that you're sitting with these amazing fucking tools that you've been given, that you're lucky. I'm lucky I was born in the United States. If I was in third world country, I'd probably be some village idiot. I have no idea. So, you know, you got to look at and be grateful for the shit that you have. When you're mired in addiction, very hard. You can have all the relationships, all the pleasures, people that love you, and you can't connect with any of it. So as an entrepreneur, stay connected, stay engaged, treat people well. People that give you money are your clients. They're not transactions. If you want to really build and grow yourself as not only a successful entrepreneur, but as a person in recovery, as a human being, be in the transformation business. Don't be in the transaction business. Get away from people that are in the transaction business. Focus on building relationships, not transactions. Treat people very well. That's how you do it. And the way you do that is you connect with yourself. Like if you were a racehorse or you owned a racehorse, and the job of that racehorse was to win a race. You know, sorry, we're talking about gambling here, which would be the other. So
yeah, great example there.
Yeah. So, but think about it this way. So if you had a $1 million racehorse and that horse needed to win races, would you shove fast food down that horse's throat? Would you not let it get any sleep? Would you drive it into the ground? You know, the time that my friend Kathy Colby says, the time to quit working is when working is no longer working. There are times when you're still glopped over the computer, trying to respond to emails, or you're in bed looking at your phone and it's 1 a.m. and you can't put the fucking thing down. I mean, you need to develop the rituals to stop that. Don't set an alarm clock to wake up in the morning. Set an alarm clock to go to bed. And when that thing goes off, frickin' put the phone down and go to as hard as it is. And if you need to get help, get a sponsor, go to a meeting. I mean, there's no weakness in that. There's actually strength in being asked for help. Having your life be completely screwed up and trying to work on it in isolation isn't something you should be getting a trophy for. It's a sign of, like, either you're out of control or you're stupid. And in most cases, you're probably not stupid. You're just out of control. And so, get leverage in that sort of thing. So going back to the $1 million racehorse, you're the $1 million racehorse. Everyone listening to this as an entrepreneur, get rest, get relaxation, get exercise, feed yourself the best foods, hang out with the very best people, and have the best track humanly possible. That's the environment. Because if you're going to function, you got to have the best tools on your tool belt, your toolbox, and your tool shed, thinking tools, physical tools, and you need the right people and the right relationships. And that's easier said than done. So, how does one person do it? You do it one day at a time. You do it one step at a time. If you're buried in emails, if you're overwhelmed, which many entrepreneurs are, you got to wake up and say, okay, what needs solved? So the books that you read, the people you hang out with should really be built around what needs solved in my life. And that's what you spend your time and attention on. And you develop you don't just pursue your passions because you're passionate about it. What you pursue is you pursue skills, that are very, like my friend Cal Newport wrote a book called So Good They Can't Ignore You. And it debunks the whole passion myth where people are like, Tony Robbins is a great friend of mine. He talks a lot about passion. People take a lot of that out of context though. You could be very passionate about football, doesn't mean you're going to be a professional football player. So, when you pursue passions, you're trying to say, what value can the world bring to me? But when you start developing skills, you're thinking about what value can I bring to the world? And if you develop a skill and you continue at it, you end up getting good at it. And then eventually the world will pay you money for that skill. And it gives you what Cal Newport calls career capital. And when you have career capital, you can have control. Well, there's very similarities with that with recovery. There's tools of recovery, just like there's tools of business. Winners find ways and losers find ways. And so you want to find the tools that winners use. You want to hang out with those winners. And if you replicate that and do that, you will be one yourself. And if you're a struggling addict, you want to go hang out with people that have won at recovery, that have been through the trenches, that have gone through intense suffering and have overcome it. And you help them, you talk to them, you listen to them, you do what they suggest you do. You put your ego to the side and you just show the fuck up, because most people don't show up for their own lives. So anyway, I can continue on my rant here, but that's some of the things I would say.
That's great. That's great. So I'm going to ask you what is probably a challenging question, but give me 3 words that are most important for recovery. 3 words.
Unlearn the conditioning.
Unlearn
the conditioning.
Conditioning.
Yeah, meaning that most people's behavior is not driven by their conscious mind. It's driven by the subconscious. It's things that happen to them under the age of 7, although trauma and imprinting can happen throughout your whole life, of course. But most of my behavior, your behavior, how I respond to life, how I see things, how I listen, what I hear, everything that's coming out of my mouth, a lot of this is just driven by the subconscious stuff that happened to me. And so unlearning is more important than learning when it comes to recovery. Discarding is more important than just consuming a bunch of stuff. And that's where people get kind of confused with, because in the entrepreneurial world, you're going to read books, you're going to go to seminars, you're going to go to courses, you're trying to learn shit, learn the strategy, learn this method, learn this process, learn this technique. And with recovery, a lot of it's about surrender. It's about unlearning. It's about not your to-do list. It's your not to-do list. And that's a very difficult thing for someone to grasp, because entrepreneurs are usually very driven to learn and develop skills in particular areas. And so the shit that's really messing you up is the unlearning. So everyone is conditioned to behave and think and respond or react, because an active addict is not responding to life, they're reacting to life. I went through a real grief state last year. I had a breakup in a relationship. And the interesting thing about me, every woman that I've had a long-term relationship with over the last 17 years, other than maybe one, is still a personal friend of mine, and I hang out with them, and they hang out with each other, and they're friends with each other. At the last 3 years of conferences, I've had anywhere between 3 or 5 of my past relationships. Some have even become paying clients now, either as volunteers or attending my event as a paid participant, and they're friends with each other. And
I'm sure you don't suggest that as a business model.
No, but what I suggest though is don't burn bridges, so don't burn bridges with people. And so, it's funny, I now forgot what the hell the point was. Maybe you can bring me back and it'll come back to me, because I have this weird brain that remembers.
You were talking about all your ex relationships and how they go to some conferences, they're friends with each other, they've actually become paying clients to you as well. And you were there was a point you were getting to with that.
There was something right before that that made me bring that up in terms of relationships. And damn it, let me see if I can just see if it'll come back to me. But the tie-in is that how I've gone about doing relationships is very much. I try to be very conscious about how I interactions. I know what it was now. Okay, so I did have a breakup of a relationship though early last year. And so I was going through a lot of grief. I was just, for some reason, that separation opened up a mother wound for me. I mean, it reminded me of the child in the past, my mother dying. I mean, all kinds of unresolved shit had come to me. And so I ended up hiring a private yoga instructor who came over to my place, and we're getting ready to do yoga. And she said, you know, if you do yoga 3 times a week, it'll change your body. If you do it every day, it'll change your life. And it made me think, like, you know, I wonder if that actually is true, because I'd heard that before, but I'd never put it to the test. You know, I've done yoga for stretches and periods, but I never did it every single freaking day.
Mm-hmm.
So I made a commitment that I'm going to do yoga every day. And I'm a busy guy. I travel a lot. And I mean, I'm not talking, you know, videos on YouTube. I'm talking real instructor or real class. And so I made a commitment. I'm going to do yoga every single day, no matter what, no matter how fucking busy I am. And I'm going to meditate every day. I'm just going to do this stuff. And so for 31 days, I did yoga. Then I took like a day off, but then I continued. And so in a 90-day period, I did yoga 83 times out of 90 days. And I'll tell you, it completely shifted how I thought, how I felt, a certain level of peace. And this is something that entrepreneurs rarely do. Even the ones that make millions of dollars, they don't have personal trainers. They, you know, eat the best food that you can afford. And if you're a broke entrepreneur, you know, you can still do this stuff, because I've been in all levels of making money and not making money. And what I learned is what yoga does for me is it increases the space between reacting to life and responding to life. And in active addiction, you're totally in reaction. You're not in response. And when you start getting recovery, you start pausing, you start slowing down, you start being more thoughtful, you start being more aware, you become more mindful, you, I would venture to say, become more ethical. You have more integrity. You place more value on yourself. You place more value on others. You start looking at things like sleep. You start realizing that you're never going to get it all done. It's never going to be finished completely. I mean, there's always going to be open loops, and that, you know, that's why the crazy people become entrepreneurs. I mean, they're, you know, it takes a lot of balls, metaphorically speaking, men and women, to actually play the game of entrepreneurship. So, you know, learning how to respond to difficulties, like what I've learned over the years is the treadmill of shit that is called a business doesn't ever slow down. I mean, I wake up every day and there's always messes. I have a whole staff. I have a great team of people. I own, you know, a big building. I have thousands of clients, you know, I mean, it's all that stuff. There's always stuff happening, but what has changed is my tolerance to it. Now, if you don't develop those sort of skills and you consume drugs and alcohol and behavior, your tolerance will shift to those, and you'll need more and more and more bad things in order to still try to reach the same sort of high, and you will become more and more pleasure deaf along the way. So my venture is like, look for things that are allowing you to respond to life, and things that are causing you to react and to get angry. That's life's way of saying, hey, this is just a way of paying attention to you. See how this guy really pisses you off, this guy or girl? See how you're not handling this mess? See how you're not sleeping here? See how you're getting sick? You know how most entrepreneurs take vacations? They work themselves so hard until their body says, you know what? If you're not going to slow down, I'm going to slow your ass down. Let me give you a cold. Let me get you sick. Let me give you a disease. Let me give you a mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's what happens.
Yeah, I've developed a trait of scheduling fun. Like, I go out of my way to schedule fun. And next month, I'm actually climbing Mount Kilimanjaro and going on a 5-day African safari, which has been in my bucket list for years. The opportunity presented itself, and living in a state of flow consciousness, which I've been living in the last year once I discovered it a year ago, has dramatically changed my life. And so I definitely recommend to anybody out there to study flow. You mentioned it earlier. I don't want to get into a big conversation about it, but by following your highest intuition and by not overthinking things, you know, you can really live an amazing life and you know, manifest the things that you really want that are going to bring you. I don't believe in the word happiness, because I think everybody has a different definition of what it actually means. I believe in fulfillment, and you'll find a different level of fulfillment, you know, by living in that way and incorporating a lot of things that you mentioned before.
No, absolutely. I mean, and just because you mentioned, I mean, obviously the book, The Psychology, Flow, The Psychology of Achievement by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, which was one of the first books on flow. And then, the work of my buddy, Stephen Kotler, who wrote a great book called Stealing Fire. I've done several interviews with him. I mean, getting into a flow state is critical, as a matter of fact. And so it's great that you're mentioning that. And so I'll real quickly go through the 4 areas and then we can wrap up. So the things that I've found through people much smarter than me that along the way is that there's 4 things you need to not only get sober, to stay sober. And when I say need, it depends on the depth of the addiction. Frankly, some people are way more severely traumatized, and therefore their addictions are darker and deeper in different areas than others. But all of it is an attempt to solve a problem, and the problem is to get out of some sort of pain. And pain shows up in many ways. It could be severe mental anguish to just simply, I'm bored and I do not feel happy unless I'm high. So however someone gets high, and so and again, it's biochemical. It's serotonin, it's dopamine, it's hormones, it's all this stuff. So the first category is community. So you got to have some sort of community, be it a 12-step group, be it any sort of place where you can go and disclose and share with someone who can accept you even with all of the bad stuff that you've done, and purging yourself of all of that shit inside of you is a great way to get released. So hope heals. And when people say that 12 steps don't work, well, first off, it depends on how someone defines work, because I have gone to 12-step meetings even when I was in active addiction, and I 12-step someone and walk them through being in it. It's a term where a first new timer comes to a meeting for the first time. A lot of times you'll be taken to the side by people that have had experience in the group, and they'll share with you kind of what to do, what to expect out of it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I've actually 12-step people who ended up staying sober when I relapsed. So by me going to a meeting, it might have not worked for me that day, but it worked for them. So it depends on how you define work. Secondly, 12 steps, as an example, are not attendance meetings, they're step meetings. If you go to a meeting and you don't learn how to do the steps, you don't interact, you don't get a sponsor, it's not going to work for you as if you did do those things. So if you go to a gym and you sit on a weight bench and try to bench press, you're probably going to get stronger. But if you go to a gym and sit on the bench and you don't do any of the exercise equipment, you would never say gyms don't work. It's like, well, of course they work if you use the machines, but people all the time say meetings don't work that never do the steps.
You have to put the same amount of work and dedication into the meeting as you did into your addiction. And if you don't, then you're going to have that judgment that meetings don't work.
Exactly. So the first thing is community. And if you're not a 12-stepper and you don't like 12 steps, or you have some issue with God, because God is a very charged word for a lot of people. If you're an atheist, we have a whole list on geniusrecovery.com of all kinds of different resources that, people can find communities. They're everywhere. And if you can't even get to an in-person meeting, there's phone meetings all over the world where you can talk to people. But in-person is better, in developing that, and give it at least 6 attempts before you have any judgment, because some meetings you're going to love them, others you're going to hate them. And even if you're not an addict, I would still recommend going to an open meeting just so you can get a perspective on what, it's just a way, it's a way of living.
Yeah, it's how I came out of my addiction. So I strongly believe in the meeting. So number 1 is community. Number 2
is it's biochemical. It's nutrition, it's supplementation, it's serotonin, it's dopamine, it's hormones. So it's eating well. In some cases, it's supplements. Like there's a great doctor here in the Phoenix area named David Arneson, who, when I first met with him, I was down there with the Arizona Corporation Commissioner talking about looking at ways that we can help bring some recovery to some of the most challenging addicts here in Arizona. And I do not like getting involved in political stuff, but I'm trying to be the catalyst of some things, because shit just needs to change. I mean,
it won't get done unless somebody does it.
Exactly. That's why I'm taking this stuff on, because I don't see a lot of people out there trying to change the global conversation about how people view and treat addicts. So I'm trying to do it. David Arneson said, when you see a toothless, homeless addict on the street, what you're witnessing in a lot of ways is modern day scurvy. I mean, they're not getting enough vitamin C. They're eating junk food. I mean, they're just not doing well. And what he does is he uses IV treatments of amino acids, B vitamins, vitamin C's, and he gets people that cannot focus, cannot sleep, and he gets them functioning again. Because he said that if you take an addict that has 70% of serotonin is created in the gut, And if you don't fix the gut, they don't have enough happy chemicals surging through their body. They simply do not feel good, and they're in a craving state. And he said if you arrest them and throw them in jail and prison without fixing their gut, they're going to stay in a craving state, and then they have to stay addicts in prison because they can't get out of the craving state. And the challenge with addiction is it's the craving. It's not just the doing the drugs. It's that constant inability to sit in your own skin and feel okay. And people that are not addicts cannot fathom what an uncomfortable, that is real human suffering, even if it's gambling or sex or food or internet or performance or drugs or alcohol. I mean, it's real human suffering. So, a gaming addict, I quit playing video games. If they went to crawl inside that person's body, the craving that video game distraction, soothing, it's soothing pain. If they could even comprehend what it feels like, the addict interprets that as survival. So if you don't have enough happy chemicals running through your system, you're going to seek them out artificially. So he has found through IV treatment, because I asked him, I go, can you do this orally? He goes, if the gut is so damaged, it won't process. So you have to fix it with IVs. And so he's treated over 20,000 addicts in the last 17 years, many very successfully. Because he said, if you throw that person in jail or prison, like I said, they can talk to the best talk therapists in the world, and they're still not going to be able to digest what the person is saying while they're in the craving state. So you got to, the best nutrition, and see, that's something that the 12 steps don't address. They don't address anything about food and that sort of stuff. So biochemical is the second.
Community, nutrition, which is great. Nutrition's great. I'm glad you said that because, people don't naturally think about that. What's number 3?
It's trauma work. It's unresolved trauma. And people have to remember that the issues are in the tissues. They're in your body. This pain is stored in your body, your brain, it's emotional, it's physical. So there's a variety of things. Like when you mentioned flow state, that's what flow state does. It actually gets into the body. It changes the physiology. It changes the way that you interact with the world. So for deep trauma, someone looks up somatic therapist in their area. It could be body workers. It could be psychologists, counselors, psychiatrists in some cases. That's where things like plant medicines, and I have to be very careful by saying this because I am no way in any way, shape, or form advocating the use of drugs to treat drugs. And a lot of plant medicines administered properly, like ayahuasca or ibogaine or MDMA guided trauma, which has been shown to be very successful with PTSD with soldiers, with some addicts, but it's not about the substance or the plant. It's about who's administering it, what you do before you do it, the environment you do it in, what you do afterwards. Like ibogaine, as an example, is one of the most effective ways to treat opiate addictions, has a very high success rate if administered in the right way, and people can actually, go through it without heroin withdrawals. It is grueling, is one of the most horrifying things I've ever personally done, but I wanted to be my own human lab rat, and I videotaped this whole thing. But it can help people with really deep trauma that they can never address in other ways. I've seen miracles happen.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to interrupt. If people aren't comfortable with that, what are some other ways to address the trauma?
Good question. So meditation is phenomenal. Yoga, Kundalini yoga especially, because there's a lot of body movement and a lot of breathing. The number one killer addiction-wise in the United States is sugar. Sugar is the number one gateway drug. The second after that would be cigarettes. I think 470,000 people died last year of tobacco-related causes, probably more. After that, it would be alcohol. After that, it would be opiates. And then after that, all the variety of different types of drugs and substances, all the way down to behaviors, because a lot of people die from sleep deprivation, from workaholism and gaming. And now they don't die and then say, oh, that was a workaholic. They get in car accidents, they get heart attacks, they and all these things exasperate poor habits, poor things that will actually lead to bad consequences. So, like breathing, one of the reasons people smoke, and my father died from lung cancer. He was a smoker his whole life. And he was a very stressed out individual. But when they take an inhale off of a cigarette, that's very meditative. It's one of the few times addicts even take deep breaths, because if you watch someone in active addiction, they usually have a lot of physical pain, neck pain, back pain, shoulder pain, knee pain, which is mostly caused by repressed emotions. If anyone studies the work of like Steve Ozanich, who wrote The Great Pain Deception, or, Back Pain Permanent Healing, I mean, brilliant on eliminating body pain. Same thing that I think causes addiction, which is repressed emotions, and suppression is the same thing which causes most physical pain. Most physical pain is not structural, it's psychological. It's repressed emotions that manifests itself in oxygen deprivation in the muscles, tendons, ligaments, predominantly caused by, anger and rage, that causes the sensation of pain. That's a whole nother conversation, but that's where almost my entire adult life, I had chronic pain until I actually realized my brain was the first mechanism. And it's real pain. It's not like in your head, it's real pain. I mean, under MRIs, I have a torn meniscus in my right knee, 2 herniated discs in my neck and back. Used to hurt all the time. They no longer hurt anymore, because it's not about what an MRI shows. It's about how, I mean, that's a whole nother discussion, but
yeah, well, no, it's interesting. Just real quickly, and we'll get to number 4. But it's interesting you said that, because I had 2 back surgeries. I've had severe sciatic pain from my left glute shooting down to the bottom of my left foot, where my foot would be tingling all day long, and I couldn't sit normally, and I have to give excuses to, like, I'm in a meeting, I would have to tell them up front, hey, look, everything's fine. I just, I have this disc problem. And the doctor told me I needed a 3rd surgery after I was in severe pain. And I said, no, like, I am not going through a 3rd surgery. And what I started doing is rigorously stretching every morning, which I hadn't done before, rigorously stretching every morning, and, built in a routine and started eating a lot better. And within 3 weeks, the pain started dissipating to a point where I didn't even realize I had an issue about a month later. So, the MRI doesn't tell the story, and the doctors, they want you to have surgery they're surgeons for a reason, right?
Oh, yeah.
It just goes to your point. So I just wanted to throw that example in, that I've lived that. I'm a living creature of what you just described. But,
no, you're absolutely right. It's a great point. And most doctors that you're going to go to are they're going to give you a structural diagnosis and say, oh, here's why you're bad. And they're going to start looking at scans. They're going to try to look at the source of where it hurts, because they're not there. And a lot of them aren't ill intentioned. They just don't know any better. I mean,
sure.
and believe me, some of the world's most well-known doctors are personal friends of mine. And so, and a lot of them, if you look up the work of Dr. John Sarno or Steve Ozanich, Ozanich, I mean, I did a great podcast with him on this. So most body pain is caused by food or by psychological stuff. So
I read Dr. Sarno's book.
It was great. And and the guy that wrote the greatest body of work on Sarno is Steve Ozanich, which I would actually recommend you interview him for part of what you're doing. He's
okay.
Great.
Yeah, I would love to.
Happy to make that introduction. So going back to
so we have community, we have nutrition, we have trauma work. What's our 4th nugget that listeners can take away?
Yeah. So last couple of things. Body workers are really good. EMDR. Things that get you into a flow state, float pods, floating in a big, like, deprivation tanks, but they're not really deprivation.
That. It's great.
So,
water deprivation tank. Yeah.
Yeah. I got one in my office, so.
Oh, really? Nice. Yeah, I might have to come by then.
You should. No, we have a great setup at my office building. And so True Rest is probably the biggest franchise for float pods throughout the United States. TrueRest.com. They're popping up in a lot of cities where people can go and float. Those have been miraculous for a lot of people getting into a peaceful state. And then, and then breathing, simply, I mean, the space between here and here, which you can't really see because I'm
right.
But it's your stomach, it's deep breathing, so just literally going down. And then the final thing is the environment. If you're, eating well, if you're going to meetings in communities, if you're doing trauma work, but then you're going to a work environment or a home environment, and it's continually stressful, you're going to want to soothe when you're stressed out. So you want to create the environment where you sleep, where you live, where you spend your time, so it's not triggering. If you're an alcoholic, you can't hang out in bars. I mean, you have to go to environments that are conducive to where you want to go in life. And that comes out of the work of Dr. Bruce Alexander, who, in the 70s, he started looking at these studies they had done on rats, where they would put rats in cages and they would, give them access to drugs, and the rats would, hit a lever or drink drugged water until they died. They would take drugs over food, over sex, over sleep, and this whole notion became drugs hijack your brain. But he looked at these tests and he said, well, these rats are in a cage. I mean, what if we, what else are they going to do other than drugs? They're stressed out. They're by themselves. They're isolated in a cage. This is not how a rat wants to live, locked up in a cage. So he created Rat Paradise, which he called Rat Park. Blue balls, red balls, grass, food that rats would want to eat, sex that they would want to have, sex and connection. Because again, all of this is about connection. The opposite of addiction is connection.
Right.
So they could have sex with other rats, and given the choice of drugged water or regular water, Rat Park, the rats wouldn't drink the drugged water. They would only drink the regular water. So he's like, well, let's see if the rats can get quote unquote addicted and hijack the brain. So he would, the drugs were given to these rats for, I think, 30 days, 60 days. And I may have this off. I have spoken on the phone with Bruce Alexander. He's agreed to be in my documentary, one of our documentaries we're doing. And basically, he would put these rats, after they've become addicted, back in Rat Park, and almost none of the rats would drink the drug water, even after they've been, quote unquote, addicted to drugs, because in a safe, healthy environment, they don't desire the soothing and the pain because of the environment. So the rats that would continue to do drugs were traumatized. And of course, Johan Hari in his TED Talk talks about, we had a human experiment called the Vietnam War, because during Vietnam, 20% of the Vietnam soldiers in Vietnam were doing heroin, because there were stronger laws against marijuana than heroin. It was safer to do heroin than marijuana. And so America thought they were going to have the biggest junkie problem on their hands, the biggest junkie crisis. But when most of these soldiers came back, most of them quit without going to 12-step groups, without doing any sort of thing, because they were back into a healthy environment without war, without stress, and they had loved ones. The ones that couldn't get sober or stay sober were traumatized, either as children or in war, or they didn't have loved ones to go back to. They didn't have an environment. So is it the drugs or is it the cage? And so in Gabor Mate says, the question is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And he said, if you wanted to create the best environment to keep someone addicted, you would create the exact prison system we have in the United States. And so the same thing as a lot of these addicts right now, they're creating their own prisons based on their environment. You don't have to go to prison to be in jail.
So I agree with that 100%. It's called isolationism. And, I used to do that a lot. And, it's bad. That's why community, that's why environment are so important, and all the things you talked about, community, nutrition, trauma work, environment, it's all about self-care and self-love. If you can't love yourself, then you can't love others. And I think it really, the 4 points you mentioned all lead to that.
Exactly. And if people just focus on those, even if they're not addicts, their lives are going to improve. And all of these tools of recovery will help anyone. And if someone is not an addict themselves, I would highly encourage people, as I know you would also, to go to a meeting and to take a look at it and try to look at these people's lives. Because when you really look at people's lives, it all makes sense. You understand why they do crazy shit. You understand where you self-sabotage. And you don't have to, you don't need to understand everything, meaning I don't need to get shot by a gun to know that getting shot by a gun is probably not a good idea. There are certain things, though, you just have to experience in order to understand them. So a lot of this has to be taken in the right context. But again, I mean, having compassion for yourself and others, and really, doing the things that are going to put you give you the best possible advantages. And those are the things currently. I mean, as we understand more about genetics. I mean, but even if someone has a quote unquote genetic marker for addiction, if they don't have any trauma, and almost everyone has some forms of trauma, it's probably not going to express itself. So looking at the genes is, in my opinion, not as valuable as looking at the pain, looking at what happened in someone's life.
And the things that the 4 things you mentioned, everybody is in control of acting on those 4 things. In other words, everybody can take those steps. Some more than others in different areas, but everybody can make changes in those 4 areas. So those are the 4 nuggets that I want to leave everybody with. And just I mean, you and I, we could talk for hours upon hours, but just to kind of to wrap everything up, you know, I just want to direct everybody who's looking for knowledge, who's looking for resources, who's looking for direction to the Genius Recovery Network, and it's geniusrecovery.com, correct?
Yep, geniusrecovery.com is my recovery stuff. Genius Network is my business stuff. So yeah, right on Genius Recovery, I continue to share all kinds of ways on how to deepen in all 4 of those particular areas by talking to people that have not only gone through hell and have come out on the other side, but what to do if you're a family member, where to find communities, listening to more things, and, you know, and just all the valuable stuff. And there's, you know, the first place to start is read an open letter to anyone struggling with addiction, and watch the interview I did with JP Sears is a good starting point, but there's a whole ton of stuff, and we're just going to continue to keep putting that stuff out there. And I would just say to anyone, to whatever degree you can be the first domino to help someone's, you know, I may write a book called The First Domino. I'm not sure yet. How can you be that domino that helps knock the other ones down in a good way, that gets someone on that path? And so think of what's going to be the first domino for you that will give you an advantage, and just, you know, go out there and help people. And if you're really struggling, it takes courage in the beginning, but it's a real, like you said, with fun. You know, your fun, if you don't have joy in your life will be joyless. And so you can gauge the value of most relationships by how often they laugh together. So in the midst of doing this deep, difficult work, yes, build in things that are enjoyable, which goes back to environment. You know, schedule super happy fun days. You know, you don't have to make excuses for wanting to feel good in life. And most people that don't have a lot of joy in their life were punished for trying to have joy. And it's a childlike desire, and it's a good thing to have as much pleasure that you can bring into your life. So in the midst of doing the hard, painful, difficult work, which it sometimes is in recovery, if you don't take time out for it now, you're going to take time out for it later. And my friend Dave Kekich, who's paralyzed from the chest down, he has these credos that he wrote. And one of them is, life's easy if you live it the hard way, and hard if you live it the easy way. Meaning, I don't like doing burpees every day. It's freaking hard. But life is easier when I do those. I don't like working out. I like having worked out. I don't like always going to meetings, but I like having gone to a meeting because of what it does. I don't like always eating quote unquote healthy foods and not eating ice cream and pizza and drinking sodas, but I don't put any, you know, I've not had a drop of caffeine since September of 2016. I've had sugar twice, you know, during that time that I'm aware of, unless they snuck it into some sort of dressings. I mean, you know, and I'm not militant about any of this. It's just, the point is, you know, I've realized that there's certain little choices that if I keep consistently making them, they become easier and easier. And there were times where I just had no control. I had to white knuckle and gut my way through it, which is why it's so important to have a soldier, a friend that can walk through this battle with you if it is a battle. But, you know, it's not always going to be a battle. Sometimes, you know, most people that go through recovery will get to a point where they're like, all of that shit, all of that wreckage, all of this crap that made no sense to me, that stuff that made me want to blow my brains out, all of the stuff that made me so lonely, all the hurt, it was all, you know, it's that, even if it's a cliche, you know, life doesn't happen to you, it happens for you. And I believe there's a real sense of that.
Yes. Well, that's great, Eric. I really appreciate the time, the interview. You dropped some great knowledge on the listeners here, and you know, look forward to supporting you in your efforts. You know, I believe in the same things that you're talking about. I see people suffering all around us, and afraid to come out and talk about it. So I'm really appreciative of everything you're doing, and you know, we'll continue to fight the fight.
You got it. Thank you. Good to be with you.
You as well.